Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday night segment of The Outer Realm. We are broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network 105.3 FM from the Gulf Coast, 107.7 FM from beautiful New Orleans. We are fully sponsored by the amazing people over at Folgers Coffee who have been a part of our journey for the last several years. Thank you, Folgers. We couldn't do it without you, nor would we want to. Also, big shout out to Steve McGinnis, the artist behind the logos here at the show. Check him out on Facebook and Instagram. Specializes in the Halloween horror genre, but does incredible commission pieces of any type. So tonight, I have to say, I was looking forward to tonight. I always love it when Morgan Daimler comes on. We always have so much fun. Conversation is always interesting, and tonight isn't going to be any different. So she's talking about her newest book, newly released, The Fairy Courts From Folklore to Fiction. Now, The Fairy Courts discusses a history of belief as it is traced from, she goes back to the 1500s up until today, fact and fiction, New Age interest, changelings, beliefs in connections to demons, witches. And she concludes with this incredible chapter, pretty much the do's and don'ts of proper fairy protocol. And I'll tell you something, that's a thing. It's a thing. You definitely want to behave yourself and you have to be very, very careful. It's a really great book. And I'm going to, flash up the cover and so on. I highly recommend it. I believe it was released yesterday. And so it's hot right off the presses, ready to go. Here, I'm going to put it up right here, right now. Because look at that. All of her covers are always so exquisite. Aren't they great? Anyway, without further ado, Morgan Daimler. Hello. Welcome.
Oh, so excited to be back chatting with you again.
Thank you. Thank you. It's going to be a hot conversation. I have to say, like, you've really outdone yourself with this book.
It's going to be fun. It's going to be really fun.
Oh, fun's a good way to put it. Especially the last chapter. It's kind of like, maybe, shouldn't have done that one or shouldn't have done that one. And I've known so many people through the years, people who've just had fairy encounters, being in the field of what I say high strangeness, but it's not just high strangeness. It's pretty much people who come on and talk about folklore, people who've had experiences. And everybody thinks, Tinkerbell, even she had this freaking temper. She's like this big, so not what people think.
Yeah, it cracks me up when people are like, they think fairies like Tinkerbell. I'm like, Tinkerbell in the book and the movie was not particularly like the newest version, like the children's show version that they have today is super nice. But in the original, whatever it was, 1950 something, 60 something movie, like she was outright trying to get Wendy like taken out.
But she was terrible.
Yeah, she was not particularly nice.
No, you're right. For such a pretty little thing, she's just like really, but that falls in line, doesn't it, with fairy behavior?
Yeah, it is funny because I do tend to joke about when you think about fairies, everyone thinks about little like Tinkerbell Disney kind. And that's really not what we're talking about. We're talking about like other sorts of things. Yeah. But if you actually look at her in that original Peter Pan movie, she is a lot like a folkloric fairy, like I don't want to say real fairies because there's a lot going on out there, but like she could be pretty vicious. To be.
Yeah, for something so cute and small. But I really, this book you went back. You started off essentially with the Scottish folklore, and you went back to roughly the 1500s. And I know just through other shows, like it goes way back, but it's like how far back do you want? The book could be 300 pages plus, But why the fairy courts? Like, first off, what are they, and why did you want to write about them?
Yeah, so the reason that I wanted to write about them ties into what they are. So we'll start kind of with that one first. But I found that there was a lot of confusion when it came to the fairy courts. When people would talk about them and the subject would come up, they were really seeming to lean more into like modern fiction. Like when I would ask on social media, what are your resources for this? And people would be like, oh, the Dresden Files, you know,
Yeah.
Holly Black's books. And I was like, okay, it's maybe not the best source to
Right.
look at. Because when we talk about the fairy courts, we're originally talking about the Scottish concept. And it was initially the Seelie court. Seelie is a Scots word. It just means like lucky, fortunate, blessed.
Yeah.
And it was sort of a euphemism. So all fairies belonged to the Seelie court originally. And then a couple hundred years later, we start to see this idea of the Unseelie, which is literally like the opposite of that, the unlucky, unblessed, not the friendly ones, basically.
Right. Tinkerbells. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we get these two contrasting groups. You have the Seelie, who are, you know, like the fortunate, lucky ones. You have the Unseelie, who are like the ungodly, dangerous ones. And from there, in the 20th century, people kind of turned that into like good fairies and bad fairies, good fairies and wicked fairies. But even the Seelie court fairies, even the you know, so-called good ones, were kind of Tinkerbell. Like they could be nice and they could be helpful, but you didn't want to make them mad, or there were going to be problems. And a lot of people, because of fiction, they hear those two words, they hear like good fairies, bad fairies, and they get this very particular idea about it. And this idea that all fairies are in one group or the other. And it's so much more complicated than that, which of course is why I love it.
Right. Yeah. It shows that they're much like our own culture, you know, like we are very much hierarchy in our royalty, in the monarchs, you know, throughout history, but even in our workplaces, you know, there are certain levels that you go to, right? And you have certain protocols, so on and so forth. So getting into the social structure, which I guess is this chart with the beginning, social structure, royal courts, tropping, solitary, understanding them, like trooping fairies. You have a whole lot in here that are, I didn't mean to say tropping, trooping. Yeah. So, and this can pose a danger to humans, right? So how do they feel about humans in general?
This is where that kind of nuance comes in, because the ones in Scotland that would have been, particularly, I should say, like the lowland areas of Scotland, that would have been considered the Unseelie fairies, those are the ones who kind of are the most directly dangerous. Those are the ones who, they are not fans of humans. They often will have like humans on the menu, so to speak, or literally.
That's like refreshing to know.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, not always. And this is where it gets tricky, because nothing with fairies is ever straightforward. And one thing that I will usually tell people anytime the subject comes up is like, anytime there's a rule, there is an exception to that rule. It just, there's always loopholes and exceptions and things like that. So I'll use Kelpies as an example. Kelpies are a type of shape-shifting being in Scottish folklore. They are like a horse in the water. They can come out on land in the form of a horse, and they'll trick a person into trying to ride them. And they have this magic where once you touch them, you get stuck like Velcro. And and then they'll run back into the body of water and drown you and eat you, which is not something most people want to happen.
Nice. Great.
But we also have these stories where Kelpies, because they're shapeshifters, will come on land and take the form of a person, a human, male or female. And particularly the male ones will, I don't want to say seduce women, because it's not quite that straightforward, but they'll take a human wife. And in some cases, before they get to the wife part of things, you know, he'll fall asleep with his head in her lap, and she'll suddenly realize he has like water plants in his hair, or his hair is like perpetually wet. Like there's always a giveaway.
Right.
Not an actual human. And in those stories, she'll usually then cut her skirt to like sneak away without waking him up. Yeah.
That's a good one.
In the stories where he actually marries her, sometimes she'll even have a child with him and then figure out that he's a Kelpie. And when that happens, then she'll take off. And there's actually a pretty famous traditional song in Scotland. It's basically like the Kelpie's lullaby. And it's the story the Kelpie is singing to this baby about how the mother has run off. And, you know, he loves her, and, you know, she's going to come back. She's not going to come back, obviously. But like, this is a song he's singing to this child that he's taking care of. So these are the ones that are considered super dangerous to humans because they could drown you and eat you. But then we have this other layer to it where sometimes they do have like relationships with humans. Mm-hmm. And in those stories, they're usually not dangerous in the same way.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So yeah, it's fascinating stuff. But any of the fairies, like they can help you if they choose to, or they can hurt you if they choose to. And the Seelie court is more likely to be helpful and to not do you any harm unless, you know, you do something to offend them. And they'll always give you a warning first. Whereas the Unseelie court is more likely to just go straight to, you know, murder as a solution.
Come for the jugular, essentially.
Yeah, or sometimes literally, yeah.
Yeah, for real. Oh my God. Yeah, that's really hard because, I mean, you are, you know, we all hear about the stories. And of course, there are certain parts of the world, much like Scotland, which is sort of like a go-to place, I always say, for the beginners, you know, but a lot of it for me, because I mean, I should have went. I've been to the UK. I've been to, you know, to Scotland. I never ventured to Ireland, which you talk about. But
I love Ireland, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm looking at, you know, the fairy circles and people leaving, you know, gifts in the fairy circles. And I remember somebody tried to snipe something from one of those, and the tour guide was just like, don't be doing that. And then the fairy king's grotto was right there, which is like this tall structure. Right. And I'm just kind of like, this is pretty interesting, the whole layout of it. And the structure wasn't huge. Like, you know, it wasn't going to be for a person, but it was huge in the sense that maybe maybe an individual. Yeah. My son went in and peeked his head in, and he goes, it's not very big in there. Going, maybe it's just for littler fairies, but it's still a fair size up.
Yeah. Well, and because fairies are shapeshifters, there's a pretty widespread belief that they can change their size.
Yeah.
There was actually, I mean, speaking of Ireland, but there was actually an account that was collected from Ireland in like the early 20th century where the guy claimed that he had had a conversation with a fairy, you know, as you do. Yeah. And in talking to the fairy, I think in the interview, he had said something like, he had said to the fairy that he was surprised that he was like human sized, which in the interview I take to mean like 5 or 6 feet tall. And the fairy's response was, I can be whatever size I choose to be at will. So we can be small or we can be tall. It just kind of depends on how they choose to present themselves. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. With the fairy courts, now in fairy society, does anybody get to be in there, or are there certain things, prerequisites, or is it DNA? Like it would be, you know, for in society for us, certain families are, or you marry into it. So how does it work in the fairy realm?
Well, particularly with the courts, and particularly the Scottish courts, it seems like, you know, you have to be born to have a certain kind of rank. So like not everyone could be a fairy king or a fairy queen or that sort of thing. And it's also tied to how powerful they were. So a lot of the names that we have for kings and queens in fairy they also show up in mythology as like gods and goddesses. So kind of a lateral move from, you know, deity to fairy monarch kind of deal, but definitely not something anyone can do or be in that position. But we also know from the stories that they did like to steal humans, you know, and so we have accounts, like there's a really famous ballad in Scotland called the Ballad of Tam Lin, and it's a man named Tam who was either kidnapped by the fairy queen or was like mortally wounded, and she took him as he was dying, which is also something we see kind of all across the stories. And so he was human originally. They turn him into a fairy, and then he becomes a knight, which would have been considered kind of, you know, a little bit higher up in the grand scheme of things. And then he, of course, ends up being rescued by this human woman, which is kind of the point of the ballad. But and then he gets to be human again. Right. So apparently you can start out human and then become a fairy and then maybe be human again.
Right.
Yeah, but that kind of shows us that, like, there's a little bit of mobility at certain points. It's more when you get up in the higher end of things that you're either born there or,
right,
you know,
you don't get to just say, hey, I'm part of this court, essentially.
Right. In the stories we do find, like with Tam Lin, like the fairy queen is the one who was like, you're going to be my knight now. You know, this is how you're going to serve me. So it wasn't like he earned it or he did anything in particular. She just sort of decided, which is the nice thing when you're the queen, is you can decide things like that.
Right. Right. So there's because you know, as we get further into the book, I mean, you got to this fairly quickly. There is a belief, especially with Scottish fairies, that as you have in the book, held a place that was uniquely close to the demonic compared to other post-Christian Western European cultures, what might describe fairies as a type of fallen angel, but usually place them either within their own category of being or view them as belonging to the limbo, purgatory, etc. It was interesting that, you know, that there's this crossing over, you know, with the Christianity and such.
Yeah, so it's interesting because when the subject comes up, a lot of people want to know, like, what were the beliefs like before Christianity? And ultimately in Ireland and the UK, we just really don't know what they were like. We do have some really early records that kind of show probably what they were like, but everything was recorded by Christians.
Yes.
So, you know, we really don't know for sure. And a lot of people will then argue, like, well, we shouldn't take the Christian material, we shouldn't pay attention to it. But if you ignore sort of that idea that because it's Christian, it's like inherently bad, which I don't agree with, they're still the living beliefs. Like, these are still people, they were Christian, but they still believed in these beings. They still encountered them. They still told stories about them.
Well, when the church came into an area, they would merge a lot of the beliefs together to incorporate it, to make people feel more comfortable, I guess, being blended in, right?
Yeah,
like they would mix.
Yeah, and in a lot of places, even when they tried to kind of discourage people from believing in these things, it was such an integrated part of people's lives that they just wouldn't stop believing in it. So it kind of gets incorporated, and that's what we see happening, which is what started your original question, where the church comes in, and there's only two options in Christianity, particularly in the early modern period. It was either angels, and hence from God, or demons, and hence not from God.
Right.
And so what's funny is, if you look at Ireland, they sort of view fairies like not exactly demons, but sort of like stuck in that middle ground, like you were talking about. You know, they're not bad enough to be demons, but they're not good enough to be angels. One of the stories that you'll find in Ireland is this idea that when there was a big war in heaven, which is when all the angels and Lucifer got thrown out, and you have hell and demons, that the fairies were the angels that didn't choose a side. So the angels that were on God's side stayed angels. The angels that rebelled became demons. And the angels that just kind of stood on the sidelines and, you know, didn't want to commit to a team, so to speak.
Yeah.
As the fairies. Yeah.
Neutral.
The neutral didn't help them out in the long run. But yeah.
Right.
But if you look at Scotland, they have the viewpoint, or at least in the early modern period, the idea was that fairies were like demon light. You know, they were demons, but they weren't really that bad.
Right. Yeah.
There's actually a really interesting belief in Scotland and the lowland areas that the fairies kind of rent fairyland, rent the world of fairy from hell.
Yes.
Subletting.
Right. Yeah.
Which I love that concept.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's interesting because there's so much of it. It's so parallel. But mind you, I find a lot of the old folklore is parallel, to the evolution of the civilization at that time and how things just sort of grow from there. Um, 1 second here. Michael, there we go. Michael says, how have the beliefs about the connections between fairies, demons, and witches evolved over time according to your research?
So that's a great question. It depends a little on what area we're looking at, but like in Scotland, for example, the church worked really hard to try to really demonize fairies and make them like totally off limits. And it didn't entirely work, but we do definitely see this sort of shifting position over, say, from like 1500 to like 1800, where the fairies are not considered demons necessarily, but they're definitely sort of being pushed more and more into that category. And then it's kind of fascinating to me that we hit this point where, they're really pushing like fairies are evil and demonic and all this. And then what happens is the people who actually have these beliefs, not the church, not the clergy people, that's when we see this divide into two courts. And so they do say, okay, there is this group, the Unseelie, that are, really bad and dangerous and they hate humans. But then there's this other group, which is not that bad. And, it's just fascinating to me that like, even when it got really pushed over that period of time, instead of it falling into, oh no, all fairies are just demons and evil, they kind of change it into, well, okay, some of them are. Yeah. But the rest of them aren't. So that was probably the biggest thing that I noticed changing over time.
Yeah.
Was this, this push. And then they're like, well, okay, maybe these over here, but still not these over here.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So when you start getting into some of this overlapping stuff, you make mention of an overlap between fairies and the human dead, particularly ancestors. So while the church was strong in condemnation of fairies as demons, the lady was less swayed by this view and began a different viewpoints of these beings. And the idea that the dead can or represent part of the fairy host is an old one. So how do we start getting into that as part of, Scottish fairy lore?
Yeah. So, and this is interesting because it's kind of the reverse timeline wise.
Yeah.
When we go back to the older material that we have, the oldest material we have in Scotland, it's this idea again that the fairies are non-human beings. They kind of exist in their own category, but they are fond of stealing humans, and they will take them and sometimes turn them into fairies to kind of increase their own number. And the idea for a long time has been that the fairies just don't reproduce very much, very easily. So they'll just find a human who's exceptionally talented or exceptionally beautiful or whatever, and just take them. And this starts to transition then into this idea that sometimes we think a human has died, but actually the fairies have stolen them and they've kind of faked the person's death effectively. And then that kind of moves over time into this idea that some of the fairies are humans who have died and their spirit went and became a fairy instead of going anywhere else. And then now in the 21st century, you kind of see this argument being put forth. And there are people in Scotland who advocate really strongly for this, that the fairies have always been ancestral spirits. They've always been originally human beings who were transformed into fairies. So it's been this interesting like change over the years for sort of how things have been understood.
Like Michael says, as hybrids.
So there's two options. I love the complicated questions though; those are fun to answer. When a human is stolen, they can be transformed into a fairy. And this is what happens, like I said, in the Ballad of Tamlin and then other stories as well. And once that happens, they are a fairy. They like Tamlin and there's like 15 or 16 different versions of the ballad. So some of them have different details than others, but there's one version where he talks to his human girlfriend about how he can be, super tiny and sleep in a flower and, kind of all the things that as a fairy he's able to do. But to her, he is a normal, human-sized person.
Yeah.
And she's able to like get him back and he becomes human again. So there's that happening. But there is also, speaking of hybrids, this idea that humans and fairies are, there's a term for it and I'm not going to remember it. They're able to produce offspring together. And that child is a fairy. We would consider it a hybrid because one parent is human, one parent is not. But usually in the stories, the child is more one thing than the other. So hybrids are a thing, is the ultimate answer there.
Yeah, they are a thing.
They are a thing.
Larry says, hi, Larry. The fallen angels that were cast from heaven, bred with mortal women, created offspring of giants and beasts. He goes, is this where the fairies came from also?
Yeah, the idea of the Nephilim, there are people who would say yes. That's the great thing about fairies, and the reason that I have been studying this for 30 years and I'm always learning something new. It is such a wide topic. And there's so many different things that people believe in different places and different communities. So there definitely are people who would argue that the Nephilim, which are the biblical offspring of angels and humans, would be fairies. And depending on how you read that passage in Genesis, which, I'm not a biblical scholar by any means, so, don't take my interpretation as like, I was going to say the word of God, but that feels a little inappropriate.
Like as fact sort of thing.
Don't take it too much to heart. But there is this idea if you read the passage a certain way, that because the Nephilim were supposed to, be giants among men and teach people esoteric knowledge and things like that, that is kind of also how fairies appear in a lot of folklore. So I can see why some people read that and then argue that, if it's the description of fairies.
I mean, there's folklores from every aspect of life in the ancient world. Now, when we talk about, you mentioned changelings. So essentially they're taking the person with the essence and they're pretty much creating another being, right? As a step-in sort of thing, right? To take over. Well, like a swap, they're swapping out. But my question is, if we think about souls for each person, which is a really big thing, how would this work? Because the soul remains with the individual who's been taken. So is the changeling considered one of those non-player characters with no soul, or how does that work? Out of just curiosity.
So there's 3 different types of changelings across the stories. One type is an elderly fairy that just wants a cushy retirement plan. And
all right.
Basically, and disguises itself as particularly a human child, infant, or baby, so that they'll be doted on and cared for and taken care of, and they just relax and enjoy it all. The second kind is a sickly fairy. This is a fairy, usually a baby that is not going to survive. So the fairies are like, well, my baby's not going to make it, but yours looks really awesome.
Right.
So,
nice.
Yeah, we'll just do a little exchange here.
Right.
And then the third option is an inanimate object, usually a stick, something along those lines, that is magically made to look like the person, and then is exchanged, and the fairies take the real person, and the humans have the magic stick and don't know that's what it is. So I think that would kind of fit like the question you were asking.
Yeah,
Probably
being
that third category.
yeah, being soulless essentially.
Yeah, it's I guess in modern terms we might call it like an automaton or something similar, where it's it would appear human, people would interact with it like it was a human. It would have enough of the personality of the person who was stolen that they wouldn't immediately be like, this is a changeling. Although a lot of times people do figure it out eventually, but it's not actually the living person. It's not actually a living person. And a lot of people, when they think of changelings, immediately think of babies and infants, but we actually have changeling stories for people of all ages. There's one story in Ireland where a guy is going home and sees his neighbor's wife being like carried off in this group of fairies, and he rescues her, brings her back to his house to stash her away until he can figure out what's going on. Goes to her house and sees her body laying out, and everyone's crying and mourning because they think she's died. And he realizes pretty quickly that no, it's that's a changeling, and the fairies have tried to trick them into not realizing they've stolen her. So he instructs them to take the body and burn it. And when they go to do that, it transforms into a log, because that's what it was the whole time. And then once that's done and the enchantment's broken, he brings the actual wife back. So yeah, changelings can be any age.
Yeah, it's crazy. They're very fascinating concept. This is one of those things that's always sort of intrigued me. And now, of course, with the whole NPC thing, I'm like, I have to ask, because I've never really, since getting into all that, I was like, I wonder how that would work with a changeling. So
yeah, that third type of changeling would basically be, I guess you could say like NPC kind of character, automaton. They don't have their own soul or their own spirit. They're just magical illusion,
right?
Basically.
They're just there, essentially. So
yeah, and they can. I'm not a huge fan of the NPC concept for a variety of reasons when applied to human beings.
Right. Yeah.
But I do think when it comes to changelings, that might actually be a really good way to explain them, because they can't just do whatever they want. They don't have personality. They're trying to imitate the human that they replaced. And that's their programming.
Yes.
I guess you would say.
Yes.
So
I imagine there's a lot of different type of ethereals out there who are like that,
really quickly, because that just reminded me of something that I almost forgot, which I think a lot of the audience would find really interesting. In the Victorian era, so the 19th century into the very early 20th century, there was actually a belief that fairies and changelings were not physically replacing the person, but that they would take the person's spirit, their soul, out of their body, and that something else would step in. And so when you were dealing with a changeling, it would be the person physically, but what was inside the physical was not the person. So
that would make sense. Yeah, because you hear about step-ins like all the time. It happens to people in comas. They wake up and it's just like they have no clue who that person is. His wife standing there, for example, and there's no recollection of literally anything.
Different spirit coming in.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. When you said ethereal, that's what reminded me of it.
Yeah. No. It is an interesting concept. It's just how, live people. People who have, lived their lives, basically just said like, no, this happened to me when I was a certain age, and someone came in, and some of these people go into hypnosis, and there's like this two sets of memories. One that is totally non-sequitur to this individual currently there, who has their own set of memories.
Yep. And it's interesting. So once in my life have I encountered someone, and it was I think it was like a 12 or 13-year-old boy, his mother, who I don't know exactly what was going on, but whatever was inside that physical form was not a human spirit. It's the only time I've ever seen that in my life, but I have talked to a friend who had a similar experience. And I would probably personally label that some kind of changeling. Like the physical form was there, but whatever was going on the inside was something different.
Right. Oh my God.
Yeah.
It's a crazy world. Yeah.
Things happen.
The ethereal world, like I said, we I think just hit the tip of the iceberg, really, with the grand scheme of how old this planet is. Let's get into the multiverse, or universe, multiple dimensions, and I mean, you can't fathom it all. I don't think people can. Sometimes some people can't really grasp the like how immense this whole thing really is. It's so much deeper, deep rabbit hole.
I think we've talked on one of the other shows about when we were talking about what is the land of fairy.
Yes.
That there are some people today that believe it is like interdimensional or extra dimensional.
Yes.
It's a separate reality that's kind of layered onto ours. So yeah, fascinating stuff.
It is, because but it's like all beings. They'll say the same thing about cryptids. They'll say the same about extraterrestrials. Like they just sort of, like they don't, it's not even like they portal in. Like sometimes they just step over and they're right there. It's so interesting. Morality. I love how you cover literally everything, how humans are more reserved, and how fairies just, no, let's throw caution to the wind. We're promiscuous. Let's just have a good time. Let's just, and it's pretty crazy. It makes me think of True Blood. There's a couple of times that show came up in my mind, reading some of your stuff, and Suki comes in, I'm a fairy. She ends up in the fairy world and everybody's just having this great time. And she's like, wow,
They say that the world of fairy is often a fun place. It's often a dangerous place too, but that it is a place that very much emphasizes like enjoying your life, and enjoying whatever it is you want to enjoy. And there's definitely a lot of sources that will say that fairies are immoral, and I wouldn't agree with that. I think they're more amoral. They just, their concept of morality is so different from the human concept.
It contradicts it completely.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, yeah. And it's actually interesting. The word fairy became a term in the, I believe it was 1800s, for promiscuous women. Like if you're a promiscuous woman, you might be called a fairy. Right. Yeah, but the reason for it was because fairies were considered to be beings that were very interested in having a good time, I guess we could say.
Right.
And then, of course, from there, it became a slang term for homosexual men for a very similar reason. But, it's interesting to see like how that terminology got applied to humans based on this idea that, well, if anyone's going to be doing stuff they shouldn't be doing from a human perspective, it's probably going to be fairies.
Right. Yet, we get into, the chapter where you start getting into different things like the Scottish courts, and you start moving your way down. And then I found, and I'm very interested in this because you talk about Saint Michael, the archangel. How the heck does he fit in as a fairy king? I'm like, what?
So Scottish folklore is so fascinating, and I'm mostly talking about like lowland Scotland with a lot of stuff in the book, because that's kind of just where this is all focused. There are different beliefs in other parts of Scotland. It is a diverse country, but because of that sort of push to demonize fairies that we see in like the 16, 17, 1800s, we start to run into this idea of the devil as the king of fairy. That usually it's fairy queens in a lot of the stories, but when kings come up, in many cases, we see this idea that the devil is somehow connected to this. And then, of course, when we start to see this split, so now we have good fairies and bad fairies, Seelie court and Unseelie court. Obviously, the devil is not going to rule the good fairies. So I was talking to people when I was writing the book. I was talking to people in Scotland, and they were sharing stories about this idea that Archangel Michael, Saint Michael, it would be the king or the leader of the good fairies, the Seelie court, and it has to do with his I don't want to say folklore because that sounds a little weird in this context, but
Folk belief, yeah.
yeah, how he's understood in Catholicism
Mm.
as this sort of, defender against demons and this sort of warrior archangel. And, there's layers to it, but sort of connecting to this idea that that is very similar to the beliefs about the king of the fairies.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's this really, really fascinating idea. And it may go back earlier than the 20th century. I don't mean to sound like it's a super new thing.
Mhm.
It's just the people I was talking to,
Mhm.
are people who are still alive. So clearly we're not around in the
Yes,
1700s.
yes, yes. But it shows the balance because, like, well, let's touch on the belief of demons and, devil being, the king of fairies, even the mean fairies, the bad fairies. So, does this come back to a Christian belief, or is this like, does it integrate that way, or is it just from the old lore, what they call demons, or like,
Yep. So something that we see during the Scottish witchcraft trials, which is 16th and 17th century Scotland,
mm,
is the people who are doing the persecutions were often very, very Christian. And so everything to them was demons. If it
mhm,
wasn't from God and it wasn't angels, it was demons. But a lot of the people that were getting persecuted,
mm,
the accused witches, um, would kind of argue that no, it wasn't demons, it was fairies. And especially people who had been cunning folk, like these were magical practitioners in their communities, sometimes who had been acting like that for decades. That was what they did as their career. And then something happens, a customer's disappointed, or someone gets offended and they get accused of practicing witchcraft. And they would always say, no, it was the fairies who taught them their magic, their skill. It wasn't the devil. They had nothing to do with that. It was the fairies. It was the fairy queen. But the people that were recording these things were still saying, well, of course, this is all demons. These people are just too, uneducated and stupid to realize that
mhm.
what they're dealing with is actually demons, because that's the only option.
Yeah.
It's either God or it's demons.
Yes.
And I think that was the source of, or the start of a lot of this. So it kind of gets very muddled where you have, people who don't have the belief saying, well, this is demons. And then you have
Mhm,
the people who have the folk belief saying, well, no, this is fairies.
mhm,
And then as time goes by, it starts to get really blurry
mm,
and kind of muddied together.
mhm.
So now we have these stories where, you know, they might say it's a demon, but they're describing a fairy, or, they might say it's a fairy, but also that that's connected to the devil, that
Yeah,
the devil's the king of the fairies, that kind of thing. So yeah,
yeah.
it's a mess.
Yes.
It is at
Well,
this point.
I guess it happens when you're merging in so many belief systems into one society.
Yeah.
You have to you're going to get that blend, like what it means to every individual person, you know?
And, I think for myself, like I know some people look at this and they get kind of depressed and they're like, well, now, there's so much of that Christian overlay to it. How are we going to figure out what was maybe there before that? But I think it's super cool that the belief was so strong
Mhm,
that it survived, even with all these attempts to like stamp it out and all these attempts to make it something evil.
mm,
And yet people today still, maybe not as many as they used to, but people say do still believe these things. They do still have experiences and all of this. So,
mhm,
it's just, it really speaks, I think, to like how
mhm,
many people have these encounters. Because
mhm.
that's, in my mind, that's the only explanation for how can this be so persistent over time. if people weren't actually encountering these spirits, weren't actually having experiences with these beings, why would it keep
resurfacing?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking like 500 years. I mean, that's
a long time for something to stick,
Yeah.
Well, we're just talking about that. And fairy houses, people make them. Do they ever get occupied? And I would add to that, would you want them to really be occupied with everything, in lieu of your research?
I mean, I personally would be really hesitant to have one in my house. I do think when you put out an invitation to spirits, and what it doesn't matter what kind of spirit we're talking about here, any kind of spirit, fairies included, when you put out an invitation, you are sometimes going to get a response. Not always, like you put out a bird house, maybe the birds just don't like the house you got and nothing's ever going to live in it. Yeah. Or, something's going to move in. And when you put that invitation out, when you have a fairy house and your purpose with it is, I want to invite these beings in, sometimes that is what is going to happen. And if you're not really careful with what you're inviting in, just like people who want to have experiences with like ghosts, who are like, any spirit that wants to come in and be around me, you never say things like that.
Yeah.
Because you don't know what you're going to get.
It's true. Yeah, you're 100% correct with that. And with fairies, because you don't, as we go along, you do talk about how they can be manipulative and sneaky, and you really have to be specific in your wording. And even then, if it's not worded properly, right? We'll get to that. Just because I'm seeing some comments saying good fairies only, I'm like, it doesn't mean that they're not sneaky fairies, but
I mean. And good is a little ambiguous.
See, there we go, Patsy. So you also get into, like, when you think about fairies, a lot of people think United Kingdom, they think Scotland, they think Ireland, leprechauns, that sort of spins off of all of that. But you're talking about places like, again, Wales, we expect it. France, I've been to France. I know people who've had fairy experiences in France, but that one didn't really catch me as off guard. But I did like the King Arthur mention that you did. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about that before we move on?
Yeah, so I guess I would kind of technically fall under Welsh to a degree, but
yeah,
Welsh or maybe Cornish. But so you have kind of separate, distinct ideas. You have Cornish fairy folklore, you have Welsh fairy folklore, and then you have Arthurian stuff.
Yes.
Is sort of, an odd man in this equation, but not so much the newer or more recent Arthurian stuff, the stuff that was being written like relatively more recently.
Yes.
Whatever,
Yes. Yeah, because that's Welsh stuff. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Because King Arthur, as his stories kind of went on, did become very, very Christian. Mm-hmm. And then you get that, like the whole search for the Holy Grail and all of that coming in. Mm-hmm. But if you look at some of the older material, and particularly like the oldest material we have, it was not about the Christian stuff, which we see later, and it was a lot about fairies. So, there's different stories with some of his knights where they encounter fairy women and have fairy experiences. We see this idea in Welsh mythology that, the world of fairy in Wales, Annwfn, is ruled by, potentially there's two different possible kings there, but one of them, and he ends up encountering one of Arthur's knights, and it doesn't go well, and then Arthur shows up to try to clarify everything and make a judgment on what's happening. We have this idea that when King Arthur's mortally wounded, he was brought by 9 fairy women to an otherworldly island to be healed. And then the original prophecy is that he was brought to the island to be healed, and then he would eventually come back. And I think that later on became that he was buried, or he was living in a cave under the Tor in Glastonbury, something like that.
Mm.
So yeah, so there's all these fascinating layers of like fairy material in with the Arthurian stuff that a lot of people aren't aware of because it is kind of the older material.
Yeah. But I think that just lends to, because I mean, it lends to everything coming around full circle with that stuff, because you see how many, like, even pictures and paintings that are done with knights and fairies, especially in the Arthurian age.
Yep. It actually cracks me up because there's like three different fairly popular
Hmm.
pieces of artwork that over the last like 100 or so years, and it's usually a knight. There's one that you'll see all the time on like romantic stuff, and it's the woman in like the pinkish red dress on the horse, and she's kind of leaning forward, and the knight's like standing in front of her with his arms out. And there's another one where the knight is laying down on the ground and she's standing over him. And then there's a third one. I'm trying to remember what that one is, but either way, a lot of people look at that like, oh, this is so romantic. This is like epic medieval romance. And it's actually illustrations for a poem called La Belle Dame Sans Merci, which I am sure I'm mauling because I don't speak French, but um, basically the beautiful woman without mercy.
Oh,
Um, yeah, which is a poem. And the woman in those pictures is a fairy, and the knight is about to not have a long lifespan.
about to expire. Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
she seduces him and leaves him to pine and waste away,
Hmm.
basically.
Nice.
Yeah, but it's just fascinating the way that like people without the context of the image
Hmm.
see the beautiful woman and the knight and assume it's like this romantic love thing.
Harmless. Yes.
Yeah, and that
Yes.
is not what's happening in that
Right.
picture.
That is funny. Not funny, but
Well,
interesting how we perceive it,
yeah.
It's very, very interesting. Um, Larry says, "Have you ever heard of a wood nymph? Is there such a thing?" I read it in an old book, that was about folklore, and Wayne says to Larry, "I've heard about them, tree nymphs as well. My folks are from Britain and used to speak with them from stories from their parents."
Yeah, so nymphs originally come from, I think it's either Greek or Roman. I can't speak
Mhm.
tonight. Greek or Roman. There we go. Mythology. Way, way back, 2000, 2,500 years ago. But this really fascinating thing happened when um, people were trying to write about Anglo-Saxon. So this would have been 1,000 years ago, 1,100 years ago in England, roughly. Spirits, they didn't have the words to use to translate because everything was written in Latin. So they were talking about what we would call elves now, alpha, which is AELFE. But they were trying to figure out how do you explain this to a Latin reading, writing, speaking audience. So they used the word nymph. And so we get this idea in England, which I think is so cool, of all of these different kinds of nymphs. There's wood nymphs and um, tree nymphs and water nymphs and river nymphs. Like the nymphs, wherever you look, they're every,
Everywhere.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. Can't swing a stick without hitting a nymph. Um,
Mm.
but it's a term that was being used to describe elves, and then the word elf was replaced with the word fairy in the 14th century. So it's all just basically different terms for effectively the same thing. It just
Mm.
depending on what language we're using,
Yes,
there's different words, but they're all talking about the same kind of spirit, if that makes sense to everybody.
it does. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so as we start talking about different locations, um, Romania. Now, I've been some
Oh,
time.
cool.
One does not think of fairies when
I'm a
you
little
think.
jealous that you've been to Romania. That's very cool.
Oh, I love it. I love it. It's incredible. If you get aside all the tourist stuff, I have to say it's a it's a beautiful country. You have like all the dense forests, and you have the Carpathians. You have the history itself. You go to parts of it where time stands still. There's still old horses with in carts, and like, or old carts and horses, and people like living the way they did probably a couple of 100 years ago. Some of the structures are still, people live in these homes still. It's incredible. But you do not think of fairies. You think of vampires, witches, werewolves. And I think maybe, you know, of course, fairies are being overshadowed by all of this other stuff. But there's quite a rich folklore about fairies, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. So I have a friend named Daniela Simona, and she's written several books. Her first book is, I want to say it's called like Where Fairies Meet, and it's comparing Irish and Romanian fairy beliefs.
Wow.
And then she has a second book, I think it's called A Fairy Path, where she talks about, she grew up in Romania. She lives in the US now,
Yeah.
but she was trained by her grandmother, who was like a traditional, they call it a fairy seer. I don't know what the term is in Romanian, but that's how she
Yeah.
says it in English. And
Amazing.
yeah, and kind of what it was like for her, sort of learning about these beings and these folk beliefs from a very young age. And it was talking to her that inspired me to include it in this book,
Yeah.
because I think we were having a conversation about just the concept of the courts and the Seelie and Unseelie and the good and bad and all that. And she was the one who mentioned, actually, they have this, a very similar idea in Romania,
Mm.
that you have this particular type of fairy, by obviously the specific Romanian name, and they're considered to be more benevolent generally, more helpful generally, always potentially dangerous because all spirits are, but all
Yeah.
humans are too, to be fair. And then you have this other group in Romania that are more like the Unseelie. They're more overtly dangerous to humans. And kind of talking to her and listening to her kind of explain how this system worked, it really did sound very similar. So I wanted to make sure I included it just to give people kind of that wider view. I
Mm.
do believe that there are fairy-like beings everywhere. Every human culture, I think, has this type of spirit that we would call a fairy in English. But I don't know enough about the majority of them to really get into like how closely they compare or don't compare
Mm-hmm.
to the court systems. But talking to Daniela, I definitely wanted to include the
Right.
Romanian into
Yeah.
that. It's fascinating stuff. And I think the fact that you have those sorts of views in such diverse places kind of speaks to there is something deeper going on with this concept, you know?
I have to say, when we think of Romania, I mean, it's believed, when you talk about the haunted forest, for example, most haunted forests in the world, all kinds of things are seen there. There's high levels of high strangeness. And I have to say, I've been there. There's some crazy stuff that happens in there. But when you talk about disappearances,
Mm,
a forest is someplace where I think, there would be a fairy realm as well. And Romania is one of the last places in Europe, aside from, again, with the Black Forest, like with very dense forests that are,
very old.
unfortunately, when I was there, they were just starting to take trees down and such, which was very sad, on the scale, logging, can get out of hand. But it sort of now makes me question, how many of these disappearances may have had did
Yeah.
fairies perhaps have a hand in?
So I've been asked before, and I think it's a fascinating topic about the 411 disappearances,
Yes.
which is,
Yes.
yeah, of course, the thing we have here in the US in particular. But
Mhm.
I think if we look at the folklore, I think if we look at sort of the range of beliefs,
Mhm.
um, the idea that they steal humans is pretty widespread. That is not just in Scotland.
Yes.
And there's definitely a belief, or at least an implication, that when people go missing, sometimes they're not going to be found because they're not here anymore. Like in this,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Well,
and
yeah. I think it lends to the fact, like, is there an extraterrestrial connection? Are they a race of extraterrestrials? And it's funny because Michael was just saying, is there a connection between fairy lore and crop circles?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's my view on this.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
I tend to think, so this is, I should preface this by saying, this is actually a pretty hotly debated topic between like fairy folklorists and some ufologists. And generally the stuff that we associate now with like UFOs and alien abductions and things like that, if you didn't say aliens and you didn't say UFOs and you just described what happened, would fit the older folklore for fairies. So from a fairy perspective, I would say that UFO and alien encounters are just modern understandings of fairies. From a
Yes.
ufologist perspective, they say the exact opposite.
Yes.
They say that all the historic accounts of fairies and fairy abductions are actually an understanding of UFOs and aliens for people that don't have that concept of UFOs and aliens. I highly recommend the work of Joshua Cutchin.
Oh, he's been on. Yes.
Yeah, for this subject. Joshua,
thank you for that.
Too.
Yes.
For the alien fairy crossover.
Yes.
He's written a couple really good books. And speaking of the 411 disappearances, he has a book called Thieves in the Night, which really digs into kind of all that end of the things. And Trojan Feast is the one that I personally, I love that book so much. I recommend it all the time because he takes, which I know you had him as a guest, but
yes.
he takes alien abduction stories. He takes Sasquatch stories, which are fascinating. And then he takes fairy stories and kind of compares them and finds all the like through lines. And that the overlap is really interesting.
Yes, you're not wrong. They're very parallel, you know. So yeah, which brings us into the New Age part of the book. So can we delve into that? Because you look at everything now with fairies, commercially speaking, they're everywhere. Movies, books, merchandise. I mean, people love fairies in this new age.
They do. They have good PR.
Oh, yes. Yes. So how has this movement impacted the New Age movement? How has it impacted modern views on fairy social structures?
So, tiny bit of history, and I promise I will not just go off on this subject.
It is your show.
Next 45 minutes is just me explaining theosophy. Yeah. So, theosophy was a spiritual / magical movement in the late 19th century, like 1880s, 1890s. And theosophy had an interesting view of a lot of things. It was also extremely popular around that time period. And theosophy took fairies and said, okay, all of these different named types of beings, leprechauns, brownies, elves, sylphs, whatever, these are all just different names for the same being. And these beings are elemental beings. They are less evolved souls. They are amoral because they don't know better. They are striving to eventually evolve up through minerals and plants and primitive animals to become humans, which was a very radical concept at the time, to be clear. Like, up until this point, this is why I have to explain this before I get into the New Age stuff. Up until this point, that is not how these beings were understood at all. But theosophy kind of rewrote them and fit them into sort of the wider perspective that spirituality had. And that has really stuck. That really has impacted a lot of things. And because it was so popular with particularly occultists at the time, W.B. Yeats was a theosophist. A. Russell was a theosophist. Evan Wentz, who wrote the Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, which is a hugely popular book even today, he was a theosophist. I'm just trying to show like that it was everywhere. Everyone was a theosophist for a while.
Right.
So that kind of concept of fairies really kind of stuck. And as we move into the 20th century and sort of the New Age movement comes about, or, grows out of everything that had come before it, They took that idea of what fairies were, these elemental beings, that they are less evolved than humans. They're not physical. That was another big change with Theosophy, because folklore says they are physical. You can physically interact with them if they choose to be physical. Theosophy said no, they are entirely thought-based beings, and they don't have any form or shape until humans give that to them, which is why there's such a diversity of that. And the New Age movement then took that and kind of pushed it further and made fairies into these enlightened guides. So now we see this idea that fairies are beings who want to help humans evolve into being better humans. And that has now morphed into, particularly with the writing of like John Matthews and Springer, and I know there's another one I'm forgetting. But particularly with their work, they've become these beings that humans can reach out to. They kind of, the New Age movement kind of argues that, or at least many of the authors in that movement argue, that fairies were once related to humans and that they evolved in a different path, and a more advanced, more mystical, spiritual path compared to where humans are at. And that's why they want to help humans. But the majority of people in that perspective see fairies as very egalitarian. All beings are equal. There is no king or queen. If there is a queen, it's just a figurehead as a leader, that decisions are still kind of group decisions, sort of leaning into the idea that they've evolved past hierarchies. So it's a very interesting viewpoint, very, very different from what we find in most of the folklore and culturally specific beliefs and things like that. So yeah, I don't want to keep going on about this.
No worry, we're following along.
There's a lot.
Thanks, Winnie.
It's really fascinating to me, because what we end up with now today is you have what I guess, for the purpose of this conversation, I would say like traditional cultural fairy beliefs, Irish fairy beliefs, Scottish fairy beliefs, Welsh, French, Romanian, what have you. And then you have this other layer, which is kind of coming from this New Age movement. You see a lot in various occult groups, a lot with like pagans and modern witches. That is the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So like if you go to Ireland today, there's still a belief, if people will admit to it, not everyone will, but the ones that will, that there are fairy kings and queens, that they have this very particular social structure. They're very localized and regional groups that don't always get along. Like it's very rich, detailed beliefs, ideas. And then the opposite end of that, we have this idea that no, they're all kind of communal and they're not dangerous to humans ever. One of the things that you'll see from that perspective, R.J. Stewart's a big proponent of this, is the idea that if you have a negative experience with a fairy, it's because that's what you were expecting, that you project that and then manifest it. Whereas in Ireland, they would say if you have a bad experience with a fairy, it's because you were rude, and they don't appreciate that.
Right.
So yeah,
it's always like our fault, basically. Right. But we didn't grow up with that. I imagine it's easier when you're growing up around that folklore and that culture. You're taught from the time that you're very little, like, oh no, this side of the world, we're like, what? Even though we have fairies, that's not something that's part of our upbringing.
It's funny because growing up in the Irish American diaspora, which there's varying degrees of how influenced people are by Irish beliefs. A lot depends on who their family was and their family beliefs and all that. But, for me growing up with it, I was always told if food falls on the floor, that belongs to the fairies. That means the fairies wanted it.
Yes.
And you give it to them. There is no 5-second rule in my house. And I actually found out when I was a little older that is an Irish folk belief, that they believe that when food is dropped, it belongs to the fairies. That means they want it. I was always taught you say bless you when someone sneezes, because I know this is going to sound a little strange, but this is the belief. When you sneeze, for that instant when you're sneezing, your soul is vulnerable. Like your soul pops out a little.
Oh, that's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you
Wow.
say bless you, the
Yes.
fairies can potentially take that person. So it's funny. I was actually at a conference last month, in February, 2 months ago. I know what month it is, I promise. I was at a conference in February. I was giving a presentation, and like partway through the presentation, someone sneezed, and I had to stop and say bless you. And then I had to explain why I was doing it. I'm like, I know it seems strange.
Yes.
But when you grow up being told that, like you were just saying, you're told this your whole life.
Yeah.
Err on the side of caution.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
yeah.
It's not going to hurt if I do say it. And if I don't, and then their soul gets stolen, I'll feel terrible. So
that's right. That's right. Due diligence, Morgan, due diligence. So in modern new age stuff, I mean, we do see this blend. You make mention that, there's this supernatural focus now when it comes to fairies. They're just sort of lumped in with all of this other highly strange things or beings. Why is that?
I think it's just an inherently messy subject.
Yeah.
And I think particularly when it comes to fairies, we kind of struggle with the language because I won't blame this entirely on Theosophy, but during that same period, the Victorian era, there was a real push, particularly in England and the US, to turn fairies from something that was kind of potentially dangerous. You would always protect children from fairies because they liked to steal people, and especially children. So you have all these protections for children. And then we see this sort of shift happening where fairies, not everywhere, but particularly in England and the US, become the domain of children. They become something associated with children. And you kind of at the same time see this idea of fairies going from dangerous, they look like human adult, potentially kind of beings, into this not only like small and winged, but small winged children. If you think of like Cicely Mary Barker's flower fairies, they're these cute little, they look like they're maybe 8 or 9-year-old children with wings.
Yes.
And that was such a huge change in how they were understood. But it also had the kind of knock-on effect of making fairies something that adults were not supposed to have anything to do with.
Right.
It became childish.
Yes.
So,
yes.
So we see this sort of idea of like, if you're talking about fairies, well, no, adults don't believe in that. That's for children. And the way you kind of see this playing out now today is you'll see people arguing about the spelling. If it's spelled with an AI, well, that's the silly fairies for children. But if it's the AE, well, that's the genuine fairies. It's the same word.
Yeah.
Saying it out loud, you cannot tell which one I'm talking about. You have to see it writing. But it's this idea of like, what do we call them?
Yeah.
What terms do we use if the word fairy is childish and a thing for children? Even though that's what we're talking about, we have to find some other name for them. So you see them being called elementals. You see them being called nature spirits. Fae has gained a lot of popularity in the last couple years.
Yeah.
Distinct from fairy. For the record, for anyone who's curious, fae is actually the old French word that we get the English word fairy from. So they mean literally the same thing, dictionary definition wise. But yeah, I think ultimately that's the answer to your question, is that people, they don't want to use the word fairy. I obviously do, because I'm trying to going against the flow here. Yes. But they don't want to use the word fairy. So then, like, what other substitute can we have? And of course, because everyone uses something different, it's not like we've collectively agreed we're going to use this one word instead of fairy. And the problem that in these communities that still have these beliefs, they still use those words. Yes. Elf is more popular in Scotland, but one or the other.
Yeah. So potato.
Yeah. Right. So when people say elementals, I know what they mean. I know they pretty much mean fairies. When people say nature spirits or what have you, we're all talking about the same thing. We're just using different words to get there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So essentially, yeah, the new age, I mean, we've just blended them into modern culture, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. The theosophy and the new age ideas are so pervasive now. It's almost impossible to kind of pull that back.
Yes.
Like I said, they've just sort of they found their way into everything. Well, not literally everything, but
Yeah, but you make sure, like Dungeons and Dragons, LARPing is huge.
yep.
I mean, everybody wants to be, like an elf. I mean, I can't tell
Elves
you
are
how. Yeah, it's just cool, like Legolas. Yeah, they were cooler, but
I have to say, because you mentioned Legolas, I
yes,
have to say that those movies coming out, the three Lord of the Rings movies, and of course subsequently we had the Hobbit movies, but originally the
yes,
Lord of the Rings movies,
yes,
I really feel very strongly that they profoundly changed what people associate the word elf with.
right,
Because I've been studying this subject, as we've established, for
yes,
way too long.
yeah,
So I remember before the Lord of the Rings movies came out,
yes.
I am in fact old enough that I saw them all in the theater.
Me too.
And they were good movies, though.
They were good movies. I enjoyed them. Yeah.
But before those movies came out, when I would be having these same conversations and I would say elves, people immediately would be either Santa's elves or
Yes.
shoemaking elves.
It's true.
Those were your two elf options.
It's true. Yeah, no cool elves.
Yep. And then the Lord of the Rings movies came out.
Yes. And
And
then it's like elves.
elves are cool and sexy
The beautiful people.
yeah. Actually, when they were filming the movies, they actually
Yeah.
were wandering around New Zealand grabbing attractive people.
Exactly.
Here's
And
some
did they
elf
ever succeed?
Here's
Yes,
some elf fairies, get in the background.
exactly.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the human's guide for surviving in a fairy court. I think that chapter was perfectly worded. And the first one you mentioned is don't lie to good people.
Yes. So there's this belief. I used to say this was 100% like fairies do not lie. I have recently gotten into this conversation with a folklorist in England and someone in Scotland. And there are a couple stories from Scotland where fairies do lie. But there is a bit of an open question, and this is what I was talking about with the English folklorist, about whether the fairies actually did lie or just the way the story got repeated over time made it twist in a way that looked like they were lying, because we have no way to know, obviously, at this point. But the vast majority of fairies do not appear to tell verbal lies. They are very tricky and deceptive. They will get you with the semantics.
Yeah, open-ended question.
Yeah. They'll answer questions with questions.
Yeah.
They'll ambiguously phrase things. The one that I like to use is like, if a fairy tells you that they love you, doesn't necessarily mean romantic love. I can love the hamburger that I'm eating because it's delicious.
Right.
I can love a sunset because it's pretty. There's a lot of different ways you can interpret that. And the way they trick humans is by telling you something and letting you make an assumption.
Yeah.
And, screwing yourself over with that assumption.
Right.
But the flip side of that, which is what I mentioned in the Human's Guide to Surviving a Fairy Court, is there's this sort of assumption we see with fairies that humans don't lie either. If fairies don't lie, then they're not going to be expecting you to lie as a human. And so when a human lies to them and they figure it out, which they usually eventually do, it does not go over well. They tend to react really badly to being lied to. Now, sometimes this is done in a protective way. Like, we have a bunch of stories where a fairy asks a human their name, and the human usually says something along the lines of myself. Misha is what it is in Irish. It literally means myself. Ainsley is the English version. Ain self, my own self. But that usually happens in the story to protect them, because then they do something that really ticks the fairy off, or try to kill the fairy, one or the other. And then the fairy tries to seek revenge, but they can't find the person because they don't have their name. You know, they're going around saying, I'll give you a quick retelling because I don't want to.
Yeah, no worries.
But there's a story from, I actually don't remember if it's Ireland or Scotland at this point, but there's a story of a brownie, which is so it must be Scotland if it's a brownie. Sorry. There's a story of a brownie in Scotland who is in a mill, because people tend to think of them as like household spirits, but they used to be also in places like mills. And there's a woman there, a young woman who is, there to use the mill. And the fairy, let's be honest, is being super creepy. And she is not appreciating it. So he asks her name, and she says, Misha, myself. And then he gets even more creepy, and she ends up throwing boiling water on him to get him to back off. And then he, of course, is mortally wounded, because fairies are immortal unless they're injured. They can be killed, but they just don't die of old age or natural causes. So she takes off. His mother shows up and, of course, is like, who did this to you? I will get revenge for you. Tell me who hurt you. And all he can say is myself. Myself did this.
Oh, boy.
Because he doesn't have, that's the name she gave. So that's
right. Oh, wow.
And of course, his mother has no way to track her down. Now, in the story later on, the young woman starts bragging about what happened and repeating the story, and then gets back to the brownie mother. And then she does show up to get her revenge, which is also kind of a lesson about keep your mouth shut, I think.
Yeah.
Especially in that circumstance, maybe don't tell people.
Right. Say nothing.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Okay, so then we move on to keeping your word.
Yes. One thing we see across just all fairy folklore is this idea that fairies take honor very seriously, and they take promises and oaths very, very seriously. If a fairy promises you something, they will do that. Now, again, the wording can kind of get you sometimes, but if they say they will do something, they will do that thing. We have examples like stories in Ireland where a fairy shows up at a house and is like, can I borrow a bucket of grain?
Yes. And
the person in the house is like, of course you can, because A, I don't want to make you mad, and B, usually this works out good for the human when you're nice to them. So give them the grain. The fairy will always say, well, I will return this in a year and a day, or I'll return this in a month, or whatever it is.
Yes.
And then they always, without fail, do that. They always show up when they say they're going to, and they always repay whatever they borrowed. Usually they will pay it with interest, like a little more than what they took. So there's this idea that like they take their promises super seriously. And again, much like the lying, the flip side of that is if you as a human make a promise, then they expect you to keep that promise.
Wow.
And unlike in other cases, like with humans, or if you deal with other sorts of spirits or deities or whatever, fairies don't accept excuses. Like if you say you're going to be somewhere at a certain day, you say you're going to do a certain thing, and then whatever, you break your arm or something happens, you're going to have a problem because they don't care.
Right. Be nice.
You would do it. Yeah. Right. So I always warn people, like if you have a fairy experience or encounter, or you're dealing with these spirits, just be very cautious not to promise anything unless you're 100% sure you can do it.
Because they don't forget.
Yes, they don't forget. And again, they don't grade on a curve. There are cases where you can like renegotiate things, but you can't just like break your promise.
Yeah, it doesn't work like that.
I'll give a quick story example. So for a long time, I would give a glass of milk once a week on a particular day as an offering. It's a very traditional thing to do for anyone who's curious in Ireland and in Scotland. And And then circumstances had kind of changed for me. I had 2 small children. I did not have a lot of money. Milk is expensive. So I kind of was like, well, I really just can't afford to keep doing this. So the first week came, and the day I would normally have given it, and I didn't. And then the second week came, and the day I would have given it the second week, I happened to be grocery shopping, and I was carrying my groceries in, and I had a gallon of milk in my hand. And I literally, and I swear this is a true story, I literally felt someone grab the milk and pull it out of my hand.
Wow.
And it hit the ground, and it was one of those plastic gallon milk. It split clean down the center and opened, and the milk was just, all of it was on the ground. And I was like, I can afford to give 1 cup of milk a week. I cannot afford to give a whole gallon.
Yes. Oh, wow. Wow.
And there is this idea in folk belief that if you owe them something, if you've promised to give them something, or, something belongs to them, they can take it if you don't give it.
So it's fair game, because a promise is a promise.
Yes. So you're better off giving it voluntarily than being ridiculous and silly like me.
Right.
Putting yourself in.
Yeah, I would have just used a smaller glass.
But see, you're smart.
Tumbler size.
Yeah. And in my defense, I had like a toddler at the time.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much brain function was actually.
No, I get that, because I've had 3 of those at one point. So I get that totally.
A lot of sleep deprivation, poor planning, and just,
Well, no, there's hindsight in listening to you. I'm thinking what I've done in that situation. I'm thinking, maybe just a little shot glass. There you go.
Yeah. Which honestly, that probably would have been fine, as long as I was still
honoring. Yes, I think maybe.
Something.
So just file that away back there somewhere.
Yeah. My mistake was I just stopped doing it, and you can't do that.
No, I guess not. My God. Okay, next one, the issue of wash water. I thought that was a very interesting one.
Yeah, so this is one of those aspects of folk belief that a lot of people aren't aware of, and it's kind of surprised them.
Mm-hmm.
Fairies are actually kind of neat freaks. They are very much about order and cleanliness.
Mm-hmm.
So protections against fairies, and this is particularly coming from Irish folklore, sometimes involve the opposite of cleanliness. So this is not the wash water, but I can't remember if I included this in the list or not. There are actually a lot of folk practices in Ireland involving urine, because fairies don't like that.
No,
really
no,
like that.
No, I get it.
Yeah, there's actually a story. This is from about 100 years ago, but of a little girl who, when she would walk to school every day, would walk past a fairy hill, and she was walking by one day, and a fairy woman was there and asked her if she would come and watch the fairy woman's child. So instead of going to school, she went and did that. And then the second day, the same thing happened. And then the third day, the mother was getting suspicious and was like, what is going on? Like, are you going to school? Like, something feels off here. And the little girl said, well, no, there's this woman who is asking me to watch her child. And of course, the mother immediately kind of figured out who the woman was. So this is going to sound gross, so I apologize, but this is the actual story. She poured a little bit of cow urine on her daughter, and then sent her to school. And as soon as she got to where the fairy woman was, because this was the third day she would have kept her at this point, the fairy woman was horrified and was like, absolutely not.
Wow. So they would have kept her, so you had to repel her.
Yes. So it was actually used to protect infants and children. I do not encourage anyone to do this.
No. Fairy lore, people. Fairy lore. Yeah.
But it actually was a traditional thing people would do to protect from having their children taken by the fairies. And the reason I mention this is that the wash water comes in, and that this was from a time period where most people didn't wear shoes. Shoes are expensive.
Yeah.
They wear it, you have to replace them. So people would often just go barefoot. And when you came home at night, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but hopefully obviously, people would not just walk into their house with their dirty, muddy, covered in whatever filthiness feet. So there would always be like a bucket of water, and you would wash your feet before you went into the house. And the bucket would kind of sit there, but there was this idea that you needed to pour it out at night. On the one hand, because in some places it was thought if you didn't, the fairies could come into your home. But on the other hand, because it was thought that if you didn't, it offended them, that you had this filthy water just sitting there hanging out. So it could be used to protect against them, but you kind of had to be a little careful depending on where you were, because some of them, if you didn't dump out the wash water, they would have a kind of access to your home happening. So any kind of dirty stuff, dirty water, urine, all of that, fairies want nothing to do with it. Oh, I can't hear you, Michelle.
Sorry, that was kind of like lose-lose with that. So, next one is never say thank you.
Yeah, so this is kind of like the lying thing. It's not 100% universal. Like some of them you can say thank you and it's fine. The people that I know that interact with like the little flower fairies or garden fairies, like that kind of level of being, they say thank you all the time. Nothing bad happens. Which I'm just saying because I know someone going to jump in the chat and be like, I have garden fairies and I say thank you and it's fine. So yes, there is an exception to this rule. But for a lot of the fairies, particularly the more human-like ones, the ones that are, 5-6 feet tall and look kind of human, you don't want to say thank you because the idea is they're going to take it badly in one of two ways. One, they're going to be offended because it's dismissive. It's like, oh, well, thank you, whatever. It's not showing real gratitude. It's just, empty words, dismissive.
Right.
Other end of it, remember how I said fairies are very much about semantics? Other end of it is that in English, the word thank you actually originated with something people would say to their like liege lord, the person in their hierarchy that they owed allegiance to. And it was an acknowledgement of a debt. It was a way to say, like, I owe you for whatever it is that you've done for me. And so if the fairies take it that way, you're basically writing them a blank check and saying, I owe you a debt, and then they get to decide sort of how they're going to collect that, which is not something you want to have happen. So yes, there is this idea, don't say thank you. You can say, gratitude. You can give them a gift, give them an offering, pour out some dairy, give them some butter, whatever. You can say it in a different language as long as in that language it doesn't have that connotation.
Right.
Like I'll often say in Irish, because in Irish it literally translates like goodness to you. Just, goodness to you.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah, because it's a well wish.
Yes. Yeah. You're literally wishing goodness to them.
Yeah. Like, I appreciate you. Does that work?
Yes.
Yes.
I appreciate you works. Anything where you're not either sounding dismissive about it. Like I wouldn't, and this is, speaking to younger generations here in the US, I wouldn't say like no problem or no worries to kind of like, to imply that like this wasn't a big deal, like it's fine.
Right. Because it is a big deal if they're doing something for you.
Yes. And gratitude is important. And there's a lot of ways you can express that without saying thank you or implying a debt.
Yes. Yes. I wish we had more time. But
there's always more to talk about.
There's always lots to talk about. That's why you're a frequent flyer here on the Outer Realm. So this book just came out yesterday. I do have the Amazon link in the show description, so people can find it nice and easy, along with, the description of what you have for the book. Where else can they find it? And any of your other books? Is it strictly Amazon?
Nope. These particular books are done through a publisher called Moon Books. So it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Often brick and mortar stores can get them in. Not everyone will automatically carry them. I will say Moonbooks is a UK based, it's a London based publisher.
Mm-hmm.
So your odds of finding them in a store are slightly better in the UK. But they do have them in the US in some stores, and you can always ask. Barnes and Noble in particular, because they still have brick and mortar stores and that they do carry them online. You can request them there. And thank you for saying you love the cover. I also, this is probably one of my favorite covers for any of my books.
It's beautiful. And the book is really amazing. I highly recommend it. I know that I just made my way through it, and there was always something more of interest. Like I said, it's so easy to go through everything, but we have to save stuff, in the book for you guys to go and read the book.
Yeah, there is more to that surviving a fairy
There's
court.
lots more.
Yeah, we did not cover all of it.
Oh, there's a lot more for sure. And definitely good to know, especially if you are in an area, and some people live in really active areas and they don't even realize it. Mind you, maybe they do. I always say, like, a lot of the spiritual communities will have fairy houses and fairy doors and things like that. So they know that they're active little spots.
Well, and I have another book called Celtic Fairies in North America. If you're curious about why you also need to be aware of this, even if you're in the US or Canada or Mexico, any of that.
Yes, and go find the archive, because we've done a show just on the North American fairies as well.
That's right, we did. Yeah, go check that out.
Yes, check it out for sure. So what do you have coming up? Do you have any more conferences or conventions coming up?
Always. I always have conferences. I actually am really overbooked this year. I don't know what I was thinking, so I have a lot of things.
That's okay.
Happening. I'll be in Georgia in July, in Atlanta for a conference called Mystic South. And then I'm in Connecticut in August for an event called Harvest Gathering. It's more sort of explicitly pagan, witchy sort of thing. I have a book coming out in July on the Wild Hunt.
That's when you're back. I believe you're back in and around there. Yeah,
that's going to be a super fun conversation, I think, because that's another one of those things where people think they know what the Wild Hunt is, and they're going to be interested to find out it's a lot more than you think it is.
Oh no, I love it. I can't wait. Just check to see if Morgan had any articles in Enchanted Living magazine. They have a lot of Fae content.
I'm trying to remember. This is going to sound horrible, and I apologize. I have written a lot of magazine articles over the years, and I honestly don't remember offhand if I do or not.
Yeah.
So. I might.
But hey, you can always contact them, and they can contact Morgan, and I'm sure she'd be delighted.
Yeah. Oh, I'm always up for writing stuff. I'm a sucker when people approach me and are like, "Can you write an article for this?" or this topic. I'm like, yes.
Well, because you're one of the go-to people for stuff like this. You're very versed in all of this, and people have a very deep fascination for it. I think it's one of those things that people have always been fascinated with.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I'm lucky because this is not only something that I kind of do for a living.
Yes.
I genuinely like it. Like, I truly find it a very interesting topic.
Yes.
So I'm always up for writing about it or researching a new angle to things.
Mm-hmm.
And I know very early in the chat, there was a question about what was the most interesting thing I learned.
Yes.
In researching this
book.
And yeah, honestly, the most interesting thing I learned, because I went into, I should say, some of aspects of this book go back a ways, but I was one of those people that initially was like, well, of course, there's two fairy courts. There's the Seelie and the Unseelie, and, they've just existed eternally, I guess. And I was really fascinated to find out that that was not the case, that originally it was just the Seelie court. And then that kind of changed at a later point, because I had no idea originally about that. So yeah, that's probably the most interesting thing to me when I was researching all this, to find out that it had originally been a single thing and that it had split.
There were a lot of things in there that surprised me, and I mean, I most of what I know comes from all the times that you've been on and all of the incredible books that I've read of yours, and, this one here sort of left me going, I really enjoyed it. Like, I can't stress it enough. Again, highly, highly recommend it. And of course, so thankful that you have come on. And I thank you so very much for spending the evening with us and sharing all of this incredible information from this amazing book.
I
And
always love coming on.
thank you. And everybody in chat, big thank you to you guys as well. So you have been listening to The Outer Realm with myself, Michelle Droche, and special guest Morgan Daimler. We've been talking about her book, The Fairy Courts, Folklore and Fiction, which includes talking about changelings, witches, demons, etiquette, protocol. It's all in there. It's not going to miss anything. So definitely, guys, check it out. We've been broadcasting on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM from the Gulf Coast, 107.7 FM from New Orleans. Tomorrow night, at our new time of 8 p.m. Eastern, friend and fellow UPRN host of the Gateway podcast, CL Thomas, joins me. It's going to be a lot of fun because we're talking about haunted Las Vegas. So, whatever haunts Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, you hope. Anyway, we're going to have a whole lot of fun with it. So please tune in and join us, and let's just all have fun together. Get your questions and comments ready, and let's just have a good time. So until then, we'll see you all tomorrow evening. Good night, everyone.